Vandaag is uw gastheer Daan Doesborgh, beter bekend als de stem van Poetry International. The interviews will be held in English. Wat een mooie stem heeft die man. Welkom, dames en heren, or should I say welcome, ladies and gentlemen, because this program will be held in English, like the beautifully voiced man at the beginning already told you. The coming hour we are going to have a chat about poetry with two poets, the first of whom, and if you would please welcome her to the stage with a very nice round of applause, is Börjel from Sweden.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Are you enjoying yourself at Poetry International?
I am. Yes. Are you?
Yes, I am as well. So I've written some stuff down on these cue cards, but we'll see where the conversation goes. The first thing I wrote down is that in the collection of information that I received about your poetry was described as a means of investigating in what ways language could sabotage authority. And I was very intrigued by this definition, and I was wondering if you were willing to elaborate on it.
Yeah, in some sort of way, yes, I'll try. The language of power. I think I've been trying to investigate that in a number of ways, and in different ways in different books. Maybe in an obvious way in my book of law called Konsumentköplagen Juris Lyrik, where I rewrote a Swedish law that deals with the terms and conditions between a buyer and the seller, and what you are allowed to do and how you're supposed to behave and what is right and what is wrong and so forth. And I did that also in thinking about how I matter not very much at all as a poet in society. I'm much more interesting to society as a consumer. So then, of course, I was wondering, well, what are my rights, if not my human rights? Perhaps my rights as a consumer are more important. And so investigating the language of the law, but also of bureaucracy. And in fact, it's also a love story between the buyer and the seller. So it's the language of love or seduce, and also as one example, yes.
So you're using poetry to sort of soften up the hard language that laws are made of, and to maybe put in some tenderness, or is this a much too romantic idea of what poetry means in this case?
It's one part of it, but another part is that when you make it clear that it is also, even though it's a matter of law and bureaucracy, if you suddenly let emotions in or psychology in, suddenly this text that is supposed to be, as one of the persons who has written the law described it to me, as sort of neutral and beautiful in a very simplistic way. But maybe one of the first things I thought about when I saw the text was that this is really, really complicated. Sort of a text hiding from itself in a peculiar way. So I was wanting to investigate, the way in which authority and in which language are we being condemned.
And do you also want to use poetry in this case to make this very complicated language, which is describing something that affects all of us, less complicated? Because normally, of course, poetry is like a more complex version of reality? Are you trying to do the opposite thing and using a complex aspect of reality and making it easier through poetry?
You know, from time to time you get the question as a poet that, okay, nice, but why does it have to be so difficult? Can't you just make it easier? But there is this thought that I like, and it's that when someone is complaining about things being difficult, and maybe poetry, for instance, being too difficult, that builds also upon a thought of truth or reality being simple. And then, you know, I don't think it is.
No, that's a naive view of reality, that's true. I was complaining that the law is simple and not your poetry, by the way. So I read that your most famous work, I cannot judge it because I'm not in Sweden where your works have different levels of celebrity, but that your most famous work is Ma from 2014. The big one at the bottom of the stack.
Big one.
And also that this work is based in a way, or is sort of a reply to the equally famous, or even more famous, I don't know, work Alphabet by Inger Christiansen. And it's not so famous in the Netherlands. So could you maybe explain what the book by Christiansen is, and how you use this to create your own work?
Yes. So, in a way, it's the reaction of the movement is the same here, because I'm reacting and trying to reply. So we mentioned the Book of Law. There are other examples, and this is yet another book. To try and cut it short, I was in a position where I couldn't read and I couldn't write for a long time, and I was struggling with that. And then Inger Christensen's Alphabet was one out of 3 books that I felt actually was strong enough, or they could hold me as a reader, you know. And it was amazing to be able to find a text that could also, you know, meet me in my experience where I was. So what I did was I reading a Christensen's book as a sort of creation story. You know, she uses the alphabet. So for instance, she starts with the apricot trees exist or is. And so there is almost this kind of mantra of things that exists and is alive. And I was trying to use that, you know, as you know, it's sort of a way also to swear myself into reality again, you know, sort of way. But I was trying to continue to work as a poet from the position of trauma and loss. And I also lost my language, I felt, and I lost faith in poetry. So it was just this real deep questioning of the work, whether it was possible or worth doing or not. So for me, I started to just write her book, like into the computer with her words, to see if I could, if it was possible. And then I started to react upon it. I started to get critical and angry and upset. And in that, I began to rewrite. So hers is a book of creation, a book of you know, also about celebrating things that are. But my book is a book about loss. So it has the verb form of the past, things that were or was, existed in the past. You know. Yeah.
So it's at the same time, in a way, a tribute to this book because it inspired you, and also a criticism, and also a reply, and also a sequel.
Maybe. You know, if you look at the book, I think maybe you can see it. It's my poems are, on this side, on the right side, and this straight right margin. But through the paper, you can almost see it's like a shadow of, for me, it's Inger Christensen's poem. And it being mirrored, you have a straight left margin on this side. And so, they made like a butterfly.
So next up, I want to ask for your opinion about a quote. It's a quote by Nagoem Wijnberg. He's also performing at this festival, I think also tonight in your production that I'm going to ask you about in a moment. And I spoke to Nagoem a little while back, and he said something that I got to thinking about, and I hope I'm quoting him correctly. I'm not sure if he's here. Okay, so then he cannot correct me if I'm quoting him in the wrong way. But we were talking about poetry that is political. And your latest work also considers the refugee crisis. That's correct, right? You wrote a lot of poems about the Mediterranean and all the stuff that is happening there right now. And I was talking to Nagoem about poetry that is about stuff that is happening today and about politics and poetry with a message. And he said that poetry is a way to say something in a more beautiful or a more interesting way about subjects that are of interest to you or that are important to you. And if those subjects are, for example, politics or something in the news, then poetry is a very good way of shedding a different light on those ideas. But if you're using poetry to reconstruct a point that you're making, if you're using poetry to get a point across or to make an argument, it's a waste of good poetry, because he said if you want to convince someone of your opinion, you should use clear language, and in poetry it's more useful to make things more opaque and more ambiguous. What do you think about this quote that you've never heard and I'm just throwing in your lap right now, totally unprepared?
Yeah, don't worry, I recognize it. I mean, I think there are many poets that talk about some kind of purposeless, or using a language or a language without purpose or without intent. And I think that's crucial for being able to create some kind of work that is that has a value that is interesting to me. So I don't think if you want to get a message across, that I wouldn't use poetry for that. I wouldn't use that for persuasion. And that is, in a way, that is also the problem with sitting here and having an interview and trying to talk about my work. Because it starts to resemble, a situation where you are in control and you're intellectually framing your work and sort of supposed to know about it. And it's quite a distance from where I'm sitting when I'm actually working in front of an audience and everything.
And in what way is it different?
Yeah, but it has a lot to do with, intellectually framing the work, trying to, control it and explain it and understand it. That is not where I'm at when I'm working. I don't have to be that. And also, for instance, sitting here and being presented as this identity and body, sitting here talking about the poetry. I'm supposed to be a speaker for that work. It's a little bit strange, actually.
And does that also mean that you think events like this one are pointless?
There is a pointlessness to it, but I think it could be embraced. You don't have to cancel all the events just because.
Okay. I'm glad you're saying that, because otherwise, we would have to have a very difficult conversation with the organizers of the festival. But so when you write, for example, about the refugee crisis, is there yeah, how do I put this in the delicate way it deserves? Do you have the wish to change something about reality through your poetry, or is it just that these issues affect you emotionally or in whatever? Well, obviously it affects you emotionally. I think it affects everyone emotionally. But do you also have the hope maybe that your poetry can do something about it? Or would that be just a nice side effect, but it's not a goal that you aspire?
You know, in a way, I think that in all kinds of ways, things that are being done in order to try and change the mess of the world, it's good. And yeah, if I can, prevent someone from doing something bad because they're reading my book, that's a good thing. If I can make someone get inspired to, do something that they believe in and trust in, that's also a good thing. But I just think that there are things need to be done in so many levels, and I don't have I don't think about it in that particular ground way of work to be done. But someone once suggested that also maybe poetry is not much of a big thing, and for instance in Sweden today, and maybe you can write whatever you like, but no one actually really cares. But it could also be a way of holding a position, sort of preventing the walls and the ceiling to fall in. So maybe it's a small way of trying to prevent all of the walls just to fall in and collapse on our heads.
That's always a good thing, of course.
Hopefully, yeah.
And can you tell me about the poetry landscape in Sweden? So you just briefly said just now that you don't think it has very, very big reach, maybe, if I can say it in that way. But what position does it take in Swedish arts or Swedish society? What can you tell us about that? I'm curious to see how it is different from the Dutch situation, well, which you probably don't know that well, but then you can say something about the Swedish situation, and then I'll say something about the Dutch situation, and we'll go on this beautiful journey of discovery.
Yeah,
you want to go on a beautiful journey.
It's a really
of
hard question to answer. Sometimes I think that we're a little bit spoiled, a little bit maybe naive, and because I'm thinking like if the political climate would change, and it can change fast, as we've seen, are we prepared? Are people prepared to work during different circumstances, or being, having put pressure on you because of the work you're doing, or being prevented from, maybe self-censorship and these sorts of things. That's a bit worrying, I'm thinking. We have this climate within art for a long time, when you can put any painting on the walls in a museum. But as a matter of fact, there are political parties, and they are gaining votes, that suddenly takes a real interest in what kind of paintings are there at the museum. And so I'm thinking maybe they will start to get interest in poetry as well.
And your fear
that is really far away from my experience so far in who cares about what is being written or said or painted or sung.
But your fear is that the freedom that artists have endured over the years or decades has made them maybe not well equipped to deal with a change in this freedom.
I mean, the freedom of expression all over the world, as I just saw the latest report from the UNESCO about this, and of course it worsens, And it's not only in the countries, the first 3 countries you would maybe imagine, it's all over the world, and it's also in Sweden. So maybe overall musicians are affected most violently at the moment. But are we really talking about it like that and really seeing that? Also in a country like Sweden, I'm not so sure.
And they're being affected in the sense that there are budget cuts, and this is bringing an end to ensembles, and there's less work and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, in a number of ways there's a number of ways of silencing going on. I mean, in different countries in different ways, and more or less obvious physical violence. But yeah, it could be funding, it could be invitations, it could be getting your visa or not. It could be.
And you think there's any way poets, by making a certain kind of work, can influence this development? Or do you think this is the same question I've asked you before?
It's similar.
That's good.
But I think, yeah, maybe. Let's try. Why not? And we certainly don't have to know the answer before trying and working for it.
That's true. Yeah, you can. It's always better to try something not knowing what the outcome will be, but at least you tried.
Yeah, you should tell the universities that when it comes to research. You always have to tell them what you're going to find in the end nowadays.
Yeah, that's true.
And then you're supposed to start looking for it.
But if you go and look for it, and then halfway through you discover, oh, actually, I thought I was going to find this, but it's the other way around. That's
then what
okay,
do you
right?
do?
So, well, then you say, oh, this was my hypothesis, but it didn't work out that way. How
Yeah.
interesting! This is my conclusion. So that's a valid approach, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a view of scientific research and poetic work that I would approve on.
So you would rather leave the outcome entirely open and not sort of project an expectation of the outcome.
Yeah. So if we would stir it into talking about conceptual poetry, that would be my take on it as well. You know, I wouldn't stick to the rules for rules' sake.
I think that's a very healthy way of looking at it. So for you, poetry is really this experiment that you embark on without having any preconceived idea of where you're going to end up, and just let the writing process guide you in whatever direction.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm trying.
Good. I'm going to do something very impolite now. I'm going to take my phone out of my pocket. Not because I want to see if I have any Facebook notifications, but because I forgot to put on my watch and I have to check the time. And I'm glad to see we still have a little bit of time to talk about the performance that will be, is a performance, that a good word? I think so. That will be put up upstairs, actually, tonight at 9:30. And it's a poem of yours, and there will be this multi-vocal performance. The Netherlands are currently suffering under a radio commercial where a singer is describing multifocal glasses as multivocal glasses. But this performance is actually multivocal, right? It's not my speech impediment. Can you tell us a bit about why everybody should go there tonight?
Yeah, because it wants to raise a question of sabotage, maybe not as blowing up a bomb or putting a factory on fire, but it's a performance that wants to ask, where do you draw the line from action and inaction, and between silence and speech? In 1916, there was this feminist who wrote, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. She wrote in 1916 about sabotage as a fine thread of deviation. And so I would like to invite everyone to see what a fine thread of deviation might look like at a poetry festival in 2018.
I'm already very curious. I hope the rest of the audience is as well. But for now, I would ask them to give a warm applause to Ida Börjel. Thank you very much. My next guest in this cavalcade of stupid and not so stupid questions is Sofia Sinclair from Jamaica. Please give her a very warm welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome, Sofia.
Hi. Thank you.
Are you liking the festival so far?
Yes, I'm loving it. But anything that celebrates poetry to me is marvelous.
I couldn't agree more. I want to dive right into it with a quote I read in your bio that I received. But the bio was in Dutch, so I sort of translated it back to English, so I might misquote you a bit. But
Okay.
You said that any writer who does not have some deep wound or pain might as well do something else. Is that a just translation of the translation of what you said?
It's close. I said that writers need to probe the wound that made them. Think about the history that made them, the violence, which is usually a colonial or imperial violence or patriarchal violence. And so I was asked this question, what is the responsibility of the writer? And that was part of my answer. And then I did say, if you don't have any wounds, perhaps your efforts are better served elsewhere. Maybe
so
you
this
could be
made me
a
think.
scientist or engineer, astronaut.
It made me think because I'm a straight, white, cisgender boy from the Netherlands, which, as far as problems go, is either a good or a bad situation to be in. If you want to be a poet, maybe a bad situation. Of course, I don't want to imply that my life is great and I have no problems in the world. But I don't feel like my writing is driven by a wound inside me, and that this is my motivation as a writer. But if I understand sort of the retranslation of my botched translation, you're saying that if you are a writer and you realize, you conclude about yourself, I'm a writer, then you should go search for this wound because probably it's there. And if you've searched and it's not, then maybe you should consider doing something else.
Perhaps. Perhaps. Yeah. I mean, when I think about the responsibility of the writer, someone asks me a question like that, it always goes back to the particular and not the general. And so I come from a particular place, individual place, thinking about, well, why do I write? And for me, writing has always been an act of survival. I started to write because I felt that I was being silenced. In my household, I grew up in a very strict patriarchal household, and that was my first impetus to write at 12 years old. And it continued as I grew older to then make sense of the experiences of the world that I was experienced, that I lived through. And that had to do with thinking about the spaces that I moved through and how does my body, my historical body, move through that space versus yours, right? And it's something I'm always thinking about, whether I'm in the Netherlands or I'm in the US or I'm in Jamaica. It's something that interests me. And so, yes, I think it's important to have some kind of anchor in the world that ties you and your poetry to be saying something. You're giving voice to something unsaid or paying tribute to the marginalized or some things that have been unspoken or not expressed yet in the world. But, there's spaces for all kinds of poetry, and joy is important too. So I don't always want to focus on the wound. But I can only speak from my experience. And so I wouldn't want to tell anyone or tell you, like, well, maybe stop writing. But I would say you should be attentive to what you're writing. And have you confronted your historical self in the world?
I think that's a very fair rephrasing of the sort of, how should I put it, unfair rephrasing of your words that I had created. But I was already hoping that they were unfair, so we could find out how it was so. Now maybe it's time to talk more about your work itself.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there are only so many poems about trees I can read.
That's
and I
true.
want to know about the history of the place of the tree and who named the tree and why do we speak in the language of the names of the trees, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's just sort of what I mean.
A good poem about a tree, I think, should already touch on those aspects of the tree as well, and not just the color of the leaves and the impressive patina of the trunk. So, do you want some water, by the way?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, I'm not so. I'm perhaps even worse at pouring glasses of water than I am at interviewing. So let's talk about your book.
Yes.
It's called Cannibal. It's your first collection of poetry.
Yes, it's my debut collection.
And it came out last year?
It came out September 2016.
Ah, okay, so the year before.
The year before.
Okay, and I thought it was very interesting to read about the title of the book, that the word cannibal and the word Caribbean actually have the same etymology.
Yes.
So I think they both go back to the Caribal people.
Yes.
Maybe I should let you talk about it and not.
Yes, so again, you know, as I say, I'm always thinking about the roots of things, right? To sort of explain the present moment via the history that has come before. And thinking about Caribbean selfhood is something that I do a lot in my poetry. And so, yes, the book is called Cannibal because of the linguistic history of the word cannibal. It comes from the word canibal, the Spanish word canibal, which is a variant of the word caribal, which the Spaniards used to reference the native Carib people. And Columbus thought that those native Carib people ate human flesh. And so that is where the word Caribbean comes from. So the word Caribbean is directly linked to the colonial idea of the other or of a different or colored people to be savage. And so when I learned that, it was stunning to me to think that even etymologically or linguistically, I, as a Caribbean person, you know, it's pinned to me historically, now sitting in front of you as savage.
And does that mean that you would rather see that in the future or now the word Caribbean is replaced because it has this history?
No, I mean, I think that Caribbean people have completely transformed the archipelago, misnamed the West Indies, and we sort of made it our own space. And so we've completely recontextualized the idea from where it came, you know, this idea of a savage. The Caribbean, I think, represents something completely different.
Yeah, I think it's for most people, you know,
Yes.
this connection to the word cannibal is this how do you say, this strange factoid that almost nobody knows, and the associations that are normally connected to the word Caribbean are much more positive.
Yes,
And
but
piratey also, but let's not go there.
it's positive, but I think in certain ways the ideas of the Caribbean too always reflect imperial thought and imperialism. Like most people think being from the Caribbean means everyone lives in paradise and everything's great. And that's not the case, obviously. And, you know, there's a tendency to sort of exotify Caribbean people and other them. So it's not completely devoid of the historical root of the word, you know?
And you naming your debut collection Cannibal, it reminded me in a way of a chapter in Dutch history where there was the 80 Years' War against the Spanish. And the rebels, the Dutch rebels, they were called Geuzen. And it's derived from the French gueux, which means something like a pauper or a tramp. And they reappropriated this word as a badge of honor in a way. And in fact, the Dutch word for a reappropriated word is een geuzennaam. Is this your way of trying to make the word cannibal a word like that? Or is that absolutely not the case? Are you trying to change the meaning of the word so that it's closer to this changed connotation of the word Caribbean?
Caribbean is correct.
Okay.
No, I'm not trying to change the meaning of the word. I'm trying to expand or ideas of what the word means, to not forget the historical context, that there's a direct link between the word cannibal and the word Caribbean. But I think that there's also strength in reclaiming and also like celebrating that idea of savagery as a vital part of Caribbean selfhood, you know, and make that genesis of violence as your power and your strength. We have that in our in the rebellion of our dialect, you know, which was created by slaves working in the cane fields so that the slave masters wouldn't know what they're saying. That is a rebellion. And that is a reclamation of this idea of savagery. We find it in our dance, in our culture, in our folklore. You know, it's all untamed and wild on purpose, and that is all a part of Caribbean selfhood. So if I say I am cannibal, that's what it means.
I would like to talk now about Shakespeare for a bit.
If we must.
You don't want to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's talk about Shakespeare.
I think any excuse to talk about Shakespeare is a good one, because there's also a link to The Tempest in the poems that you've written
Yes.
in Cannibal. Could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. I mean, the link is, well, one of the main, there are many links, but the main link is that the character Caliban in the Shakespeare play The Tempest is the name Caliban is actually an anagram of cannibal. And Shakespeare named him that because of this word, cannibal. And in the play, Caliban is described as a sort of simpering, grotesque monster. He's called a savage. He's called a slave. And the story of Caliban is that Caliban and his mother were on an island somewhere in the ocean, in the Caribbean, and Prospero, a white man, comes from, or is exiled, and is shipwrecked on the island. He learns the magic of the witch who lives on the island, and then expels her and takes her son Caliban as his slave. And so it's impossible to not then see those details of The Tempest mirrored in the idea, again, of Caribbean selfhood, of the post-colonial conscience. And so Caliban represents for us often sort of a figure of post-colonial identity and rebellion. And so that is, you know, sort of the direct link to Shakespeare.
Right,
but I also wanted to colonize The Tempest.
Yeah, so that is actually an example of reappropriation, right? That Shakespeare depicts this man as a monstrous type, and you try to change that into something you pull closer to yourself in a way?
Sure. I mean, there are certain poems. There's one poem in the book where I wanted to give voice to Caliban and sort of speak through the throat of Caliban, to have him sing and have him be free in a way that he is not in the play.
And tell, as it were, the other side of the story.
Right.
So I'm going to do this again. Good. So the next thing I wanted to ask you about is that you grew up bilingual. Is that true?
I'm not sure
So because
if that's true. I
because
mean,
you
I
spoke-
speak patois, but
Yeah.
again, Jamaican dialect patois is not recognized as a language, so I'm not officially bilingual. But yes, all Jamaican, all Caribbean people, we have patois or Creole, which is our dialect that we speak.
But do you feel bilingual despite the fact that maybe technically or officially you're not?
You know, I never thought about it, but I think so because there's always context. When someone asks me, or you know, if I'm at home and my partner is not Jamaican, so I say something in patois, it's like, what does that mean? And I have to then sort of translate and explain. So perhaps, but I see patois also as more than just a language. It's a whole culture. It's a whole self, right, that we're inhabiting as Jamaican people. So for me, it goes beyond language. Some things in patois you can't even explain in language. It's movement and it lives in your body.
I grew up in the south of the Netherlands where we speak a dialect as well. And it's also not recognized as an official language. But I feel very bilingual and I really experience it as a separate language. Even though people with a southern accent are often portrayed as a bit backwards.
You mean here in the Netherlands?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, in the U.S. as well, but there maybe it's more often a bit justified given the history of the Civil War. But anyway, I was wondering because of course English came to Jamaica as the language of an oppressor.
Yes.
But it is a language you write in. How do you so? Why don't you write in patois? Why do you write in English? How does that work for you?
Well, there are not many texts that are written in patois. There are no official grammar rules of patois, so it would be quite difficult, I think, as a Jamaican to write completely in patois. Although last night I was talking to my translators, Eric Bindervoort and Robert Jan Henkes, and they're trying to convince me to translate Finnegan's Wake into patois.
Sounds like an idea they'd have.
This idea, they're like, why not? Why not do, you know, Joyce, they thought is a perfect text to sort of be completely free, to sort of make up the rules as I go, which is what it would be essentially. And I was like, you know, I don't think anyone's ever had that idea before. So maybe in 5 years you'll be seeing Finnegan's Wake in patois.
I really hope so.
You know, we'll see. But I think about this often, that I speak in English, I express myself in English, which is, you know, the language of the oppressor, the language of the colonist, and what does it mean to the Caribbean self? How do you define the I? How can you say, who am I, or I am, if the I that you're speaking that's given to you is given to you by somebody else? And Frantz Fanon asks this question all the time too. You know, it's something that Caribbean people think about. Or Walcott said, of Caribbean people, we're all strangers here. Our bodies think in one language and move in another. And so, in some sense, a Caribbean person is always going to have this kind of dissonant estrangement of self, because the rhythm of your African culture, your native culture, is in you, but you are expressing yourself in the language of your own oppression. And so there's always that duality that I'm sort of trying to confront on the page and thinking about as I write in the future. You know, there's no real answer for it, except I try to, what did I say last night? Fuck up the Queen's English as often as I can. It's like, you know, if I have a chance to topple any sort of patriarchal system or imperial system, I'll try to do it. And I'm trying to do that linguistically. So let the masters work for me.
So, if I understand correctly, not writing in patois is sort of how should I put it? So it's an act of maybe defiance against this language or a way of
No, not at all.
I mean
That's not.
the English language.
Well, in fact, I do use patois in the book and in the poems, and there are Jamaican colloquialisms all over the poems. Not only in reference to flora and fauna, to certain adjectives, certain words, certain turns of phrase that we use in patois is all over the book. And I know other Caribbean writers think about this too. We're always trying to find ways to infuse more patois, but also to have our work still be accessible to speakers who don't speak patois. And so that you have to sort of contextualize it within the text. And so, you know, we're weaving that fine line, but certainly patois and Jamaican culture and folklore is all over the book and all over my work, always. Yeah.
I'm going to say something about myself one more time, but again, it's as a vehicle to ask you something.
That's what they all say.
You think I'm here just to talk about myself and I'm using you as a vehicle?
Well, you did say you were a straight, cisgender white male, so that's your historical self in the world.
It's true. It's well, you can't really say it without sounding like a nagging child, but it's its own kind of burden. I'm sorry for this remark. But what I wanted to say is that for me, one reason not to write in my native dialect is that the words of the language, it's lexically different. For example, there are no words that describe sex in a tender way. Are there, not necessarily this one, but are there lexical differences between English and patois that play into your choice to write in English? Or maybe your choice to not write in patois?
Again, you know, there's no Jamaican writer that writes exclusively in patois because we inhabit both selves, and so our work has to be an amalgamation of both. But it's interesting, you know, because I'm thinking more and more about this, especially in my PhD program, that we don't have any like set linguistic rules about patois, not about spelling, not about the meaning changes if you move from one parish in Jamaica to another. So it's almost impossible to create a sort of dictionary encyclopedia of patois, but I think it would be an interesting project to try to collect in one place all the various meanings. But some of it just cannot be expressed in English, really. There are words you simply just can't explain to somebody who hasn't lived in Jamaica, grew up Jamaican. So I don't know how you would do that. How would you translate those words? But again, it's something to think about.
I guess in a way, the fact that there is a dominion to this language that is in its essence unreachable is also a very beautiful aspect of it.
Yes, because you know, it's not just the language. Like I can teach you. You know, when tourists come to Jamaica, they'll have like the hospitality directors come and teach them to say 3 things in patois, you know, and inevitably I meet this person in the United States or something, and they say those three things to me over and over, and it's just like, you know, you're like enacting this stereotype of exotification. But to understand patois, it's not just the language, it's also psychological, it's rhythmic, it's cultural, it's historical, and it's not just Jamaican historical or world historical, it's also personal historical, how you come to some words and how they sit in you in patois. But this is good because I am thinking now about this larger project of how do I express all the multifaceted like worlds of patois to a non-Jamaican. Maybe there's something there, but it's also good that it's ours only.
Maybe in the spirit of Ida Börjel, it's a good idea to use the translating of Finnegan's Wake as the starting
Yes.
point for a journey of which you don't know where it's going to end up.
Unreadable in English. Let's make it into patois. Why not?
I'm really excited to see this book in the shops. Ladies and gentlemen, can I have a big round of applause for Sofia Sinclair?
Thank you.
This concludes this section of the program. For the rest of the night, there are a lot of beautiful things to do in the Rood Theater and at other locations. I want to thank you for your attention, and I wish you a very pleasant and warm evening.